Right. So we have with us one of the filmmakers, Ian Olds. And I realized in introducing the film, I didn't actually say enough about Garrett. This was Garrett's second film. His first film, which you should all try and find and see, is called Cul-de-sac, A Suburban War Story. And as I mentioned, he died of a heart attack the day before this film won an Independent Spirit Award. So we have Ian here, and I will take your question. Have
Yes.
you kept in contact with the soldiers?
Yes, some. So Joseph Wood, the designer guy, he went to Parsons School of Design, and then ended up going. I think he's in San Francisco right now. I actually spoke to Chris. A lot of these guys were planning to get out after this because it was a very confusing time, obviously, and a lot of doubt. And many of them ended up staying in, including Chris Corcione, who's the squad leader, the ex-heavy metal guy. He now flies Apache helicopters and is going back to Iraq in a few weeks. So one of the things that Garrett and I always spoke about making this film from the very beginning was the idea of making a historical document. Like even before we went there was the idea of like how could you make something that you would, we would have wanted to see about Vietnam or Korea. And so there was a attempt to approach it with our sensibilities, of course, was this idea of how could you make something that isn't just trying to purely be a topical film, but actually could have staying power. And that's why I was really curious to see it here, thinking about how does this film hold up, for one, to sort of shed light in this early moment of the war, and then two, thinking about now what's going on in this place. It's crazy.
How do you feel that it holds up?
I felt it played pretty well, I thought. Yeah, I felt pretty good about it. What do you think?
In a pretty awful way, yeah. I mean, little did we know that ISIS would be happening. And I mean, the level of chaos that these got, 10 years ago was really actually unimaginable.
And I should also mention that Christian was there with us in the early part, and he was the one that also actually helped us set up this initial embed. I think, in fact, you and I drove together. Garrett was sick. Mm-hmm. We drove to the base and got the wrong day somehow, and then they sent us back. And so. So Christian was around for a lot of this and wrote about the time as well. They stuck us with a particular squad. So they said, you are with these guys, and so those are the people we had access to. So we could do certain interviews outside of that, but it was really about who we had access to. But there was people that were more willing to speak, and so those people were the ones that ended up being more, or not just speak, but were able to reveal themselves through many layers. And so those are the people we ended up focusing on, but it wasn't. There's a few people you can see that don't really speak that much because they were very closed. So it's this long process. It's not a linear process of going there and then slowly getting their trust. That's part of it. But it's this process of getting trust and then them backing off, and then you go on a mission and something blows up, and then all of a sudden they feel like you were there with them. And so that there was moments that were revealed in those times. So it was not a linear process at all, but and not everybody spoke to us. And we also were constrained, not by any regulations, but just by the fact that these were the guys we were living with and had that kind of access to, I think.
So how did you get access, and what was the reaction of those who gave the access, essentially?
So in the very early days, there was no real state there. So when we drove in, we essentially got a driver. I think how we got it funded was we had airplane tickets and body armor and tape stock. So there was no more infrastructure besides that. We flew into Jordan, hired a car, and drove into Baghdad, the same way you came, I think. And then...
Which you couldn't do shortly after.
Yeah, 6 months later, right?
And it was the siege of Fallujah that essentially ended that.
So we then it was bottom up in that sense. So we were exploring different contacts. We would go to the CPA, and then I think you had set up this one interview there. But we essentially knocked on the gate, asked if we could stay, and they let us stay. And there was a sense that it was a front line, it was a forward operating base, and they had to have certain spots for journalists, and because we said we'd stay a long time, it made their job easier. And one of the first meetings we were there, I remember being in one of those meetings with the officers, and they said, like, well, what do you guys plan to do? And Garrett had a little bit higher profile online, and so I sort of pretended the role that I was the leader of this project, and although that was not the case, and just said, we're doing a day in the life of an American soldier. And that was enough for them. And their opinion was if we stayed long enough that we would see the truth, and that was all they wanted. So, And even to that point of, yes, there is a perspective in the film. I hope it's not too heavy-handed, but the same time, there's a sense if you portray people accurately, they still respect how they were portrayed. Because no one in the film feels like we put one over on them or weren't honest with them. And so in that sense, they all responded to the film and maybe weren't picking up on the politics in the same way. Not because they were naive, but just because they were seeing, does this look like my experience? Is this a truthful account of how it was? And people we spoke to anyways said it was. We can't pretend that this is an unembedded film in that sense. We were, once you enter a house with your face covered behind a wall of guns after they've blown their door off, you're not an objective participant anymore, So we were recording this stuff in the street and we included what we could, but it's clear that this is just one aspect of what you could see at that moment. And when we were filming, we always knew, we knew and hoped that there was other perspectives, because ours was necessarily limited, which is both its strength and its weakness. And we always thought if there's this vast wall between the American public and the reality of the war, and part of our job is to make the war less abstract, then if you can create one little hole in that wall, you get a glimpse of something, and we're just crossing our fingers that there's other views, because we know ours is necessarily limited, trying to bring those voices in as much as possible. But we also had no translator at the time, so those times when they're asking us questions and I'm pointing the camera down at the ground, when he's talking about sin, I just thought he wanted me to see his bicycle, So I didn't really have any idea what was going on. so there's a lot of that. 3 months later, you're getting these interviews. I mean, you could tell the energy of people, but you couldn't tell what people were saying.
The military's restrictions and response to its release.
Yeah, they had the one restrictions during filming was there was a detention area at some part of the camp, of which we were not able to see.
Where it later came out, people were being pretty heavily abused.
Yes, I mean, in this area, I know a camp over for sure, and some in this camp, certainly. But yeah, that was definitely a place that we were not allowed to go. That was the only real restriction there. And afterwards, no, they didn't respond. In fact, there were some commanders that came to some of the screenings and, doing a Q&A, and afterwards in the lobby, there was a big auditorium, and you see someone walking towards you, and you can just tell they have that military look in their eye, They're making a beeline towards me. And he just looks at me and shakes my hand and says, "You did a good job, son," and he leaves. So for them, again, it was that this was somehow a reflection of how it was, regardless of what one thinks about how they were reading the politics of the film. That part I can't be sure. And I was actually told recently that, and this I don't know if this is true, but someone said that this is now mandatory viewing at West Point. So, in terms of the danger, yes, but one of the weirdest things is that you get strangely accustomed to it, which is not necessarily a great thing. But I think the scariest times were not actually in the film. There was mortar attacks in the base that were very close by. But the things happen so fast that there's these moments of intense adrenaline and fear, and then it's gone. So,
what's the metacritique of the war in this film? You got that scene with Caliguire, the captain, which seems important.
Yeah, I mean that scene's crucial, right? In terms of what are we doing here? We're protecting ourselves. We're drawing fire. And that's essentially the nature of the mission. The unraveling of the relationship between the squad and the city became a much larger metaphor for the unraveling that was clearly going to come and did.
So thank you all for coming out, and thanks to Strangers in Fiction for showing this film. Good night.
Thank you, guys.